Welcome everyone to yet another interesting Sunday special. Before we introduce the speaker, let me brief you a little about the GeoParsi program. Started in 2013 by the Government of India, Ministry of Minority Affairs to arrest the decline in Parsi population. It has successfully added 320 babies to the community till date. Financial assistance is provided for all types of fertility treatment, child care, and elderly support to Parsi couples who are planning to have a child. For more details about the schemes and the income brackets for the couples who could apply, please visit our website geoparsi.org. Questions regarding today's session to be posted on the group chat box only till 11:15, max 11:30. Kindly post questions related to the legal system during the pandemic only. Now, Ms. Shamla Anand will introduce today's distinguished guest speaker.
Thank you, Pearl, so much. Good morning, everybody. Like Pearl mentioned, yes, GeoParsi is bringing to you a very distinguished guest, an advocate practicing in the field of court litigation, dispute resolution, arbitration, and securities law. Mr. Zarek Dastur is a triple gold medalist from Mumbai University. Zarek practice covers diverse areas of corporate, commercial, and regulatory disputes. Zarek is presenting a number of clients in the manufacturing, engineering, port, infrastructure, and mining sectors. Zarek's practice involves representing clients before various courts like the Supreme Court, High Court, statutory tribunals, and regulators, including the Securities and Exchange Board of India. Zarek also writes for various national newspapers and publications on corporate, commercial, and competition law. He is a regular speaker at events organized by Economic Times, VC Circle, Indian Merchant Chamber, Corporate Knowledge Foundation, the World Zoroastrian, Chamber of Commerce, Atharnan Mandal, etc. He's a columnist with the Bombay Stock Exchange Brokers Forum, where he writes on various securities market-related issues. He also writes regularly for the community newspaper Jam-e-Jamshed in his column Legally Speaking, where he answers to legal queries posed by members of the community. He has represented the community before the Honorable Bombay High Court and the Honorable Supreme Court of India in the case against a lot of things. Zarek has received an award for Outstanding Zarathustri Young Entrepreneur and Professional of the year 2017 from the World Zoroastrian Chamber of Commerce. He is a member of the Law Committee of Law Committee of Indian Merchant Chambers. Zarek is also an ordained priest, having recently completed his priesthood at the Vacha Gandhi Fire Temple. Over to you, Zarek. Before the advocate Zarek Dastur begins, I would like to warn the audience, please do not post any questions which are related to any litigation in court. Thank you. Over to you, Zarek. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shamla, for a very kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the GeoParsi team for having me here today. And thank you very much, everyone, for attending today's session on Parsis, the pandemic, and legal challenges arising out of the pandemic. So the focus of our talk today will be the pandemic and the implications which it has had in the last 1.5 years. And just before we get into the principal topic of the pandemic and the legal effects, the fulcrum of our discussion will be focused around the system of law, and therefore it is important that we have a brief background of the Indian legal system and the term law, which we all generally use. And my mind is reminded of a very famous quote which says that there's no better way to exercise your imagination than the study of law. No artist can interpret nature as freely as a lawyer would interpret a contract. So, having said that, let us look at the Indian legal system broadly, just to get a background, so that our discussion today is in context when we talk about the pandemic and the legal issues which surround the pandemic. So, talking of the Indian legal system, broadly, it would be divided into three specific limbs or arms. And you can see on the screen, the first limb is the legislature, followed by the judiciary, and a vibrant regulatory system with statutory regulators governing diverse aspects of life. Talking of legislature, Benjamin Franklin once said that when a parliament is in session, no man's life and liberty is safe. Luckily, in a democracy like India, we don't have to worry about parliament passing law which would jeopardize our fundamental rights or liberty. But having said that, we have a parliament and a legislature which is extremely active. It reacts to dynamic changes in the economy. It comes up with new legislation which is passed from time to time. We see a number of significant developments in corporate commercial law. We have the Arbitration Act, which has recently been amended to include speedy resolution of disputes. We have the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, which has come in, particularly talking about revival of companies which are unable to pay their debts, and also about liquidation in case of failure to do so. We have the Specific Relief Act. We have the Model Tenancy Law, which is being spoken about a lot in the newspapers these days, where it has received the cabinet approval of the center, and a number of other legislations which keep coming up from time to time, which we need to be generally aware of. The second limb of the Indian legal system would constitute the judiciary or the courts of law. Now, these courts are the upholders of fundamental rights of citizens. Now, as they say, a right is not what someone can give you, it is something which no one can take from you. And the judiciary are the custodians of our legal rights, the protectors of our fundamental rights and freedoms which are enshrined in the Constitution. And every day in the newspapers, we would see that the judiciary and the courts come out with various pronouncements which have a direct impact on our regular lives. Even in the pandemic, during the time the lockdown was on, we would have read in the papers every day there was a new development where the courts would intervene. They would pass necessary orders in the case we had so many cases talking about migrant laborers, the manner in which their rights will be dealt with, the issues related to employment and wages during the pandemic, issues related to payment of rent, issues related to payment of loans, moratoriums imposed, interest-free moratorium imposed. So a number of aspects which affect our daily life in and during the pandemic were addressed by the judiciary, who kept on functioning relentlessly in an online mode, even where physical hearings were not possible. And finally, the third limb of the Indian legal system would be the regulatory authorities, which are established under specific statutes, which are enshrined with statutory goals and objects, which are prevalent to give effect to the objects of the legislation under which they have been constituted. For example, now many of us would be trading in shares and securities. Now, trading in shares and securities is a risky proposition, and it is something which is susceptible and prone to widespread fraud and manipulation. Now, having seen these issues in the past, the Parliament in 1992 established the Securities and Exchange Board of India, which is a securities market watchdog and a regulator, to ensure that the rights of the investors in the securities market are protected and stringent action is taken against those who try to manipulate or conduct any fraudulent activity in the securities market to get an unfair advantage or an unfair gain. So it is an important system where SEBI, the Securities and Exchange Board of India, not only investigates into issues relating to fraud or insider trading or manipulation, it also comes out with rules and regulations which regulate the conduct of market intermediaries and participants in the market. And it also passes orders and takes stringent action against those who violate the securities market or indulge in any kind of fraudulent action. We all would have heard in the early 90s about the Harshad Mehta scam, and subsequently in the late 90s about the Ketan Parekh scam, where certain stockbrokers tried to artificially jack up the prices of certain securities so as to gain an unfair advantage. At that time, too, SEBI came in heavily and passed appropriate orders preventing these elements to be put out of the market so that they do not have any access to the market and that they cannot repeat this kind of a conduct. As recently in 2009, we would have seen the Satyam scam, which again made headlines. And I had the privilege to be part of the litigation in that matter where I was representing the auditors involved. The auditors were also deceived by the management of Satyam, who came out with an elaborate fraud. And many of us would remember that fateful day in January 2009, where the promoter of Satyam, Mr. Rammalinga Raju, issued a letter to the stock exchanges and to SEBI, basically stating that the accounts and the financial statements of Satyam over a number of years have been manipulated, are fraudulent, and have been fabricated and do not represent a true and correct picture of the state of affairs of the company. Now, that had shockwaves through the market. The share and the stock prices of Satyam crashed, and all hell broke loose where all the regulatory authorities, including the CBI, the SEBI, and various other authorities like the Enforcement Directorate, all of them got involved to take urgent remedial steps. And just to give you a very, very brief example of the kind of fraud which we are looking at. Now, Satyam virtually had a parallel department of employees running whose only job was to fabricate documents, fabricate securities, and basically provide a picture of false state of affairs which did not exist. So they would start by fabricating purchase orders and contracts and invoices relating to customers. It was so elaborate that employees in Satyam itself thought they were actually working on a regular client software project, whereas in reality, many a times the client did not exist, and it was a totally fictitious transaction which was engineered by the management of Satyam. So invoices were fabricated, purchase orders were fabricated. Now, once you fabricate invoices, you need to show that money is coming in, which is basically the payment received from the invoices. And what they used to do is they used to fabricate the bank statements to show that money was coming in. And when money comes into the company, they need to show that money is being invested. And therefore, the fraud went one step further, where they fabricated the fixed deposit receipts of Satyam to show that there were large amount of monies deposited with various banks in fixed deposits. So it was an elaborate scheme, which is in that sense a lesson for the future. And law always develops from these experiences. So you would have seen that after Satyam in 2009, a lot of regulatory changes developed within the economy, where SEBI also came up with a number of new regulations relating to listing and disclosures by public listed companies. And also, we had the Companies Act 2013 to address a number of issues which were brought about by the Satyam scam so that something like this is not repeated in the future. So, as I said, it's a dynamic change, and law reacts and addresses the mischief which it seeks to redress. Now, having spoken of the Indian legal system, let me very briefly tell you what the practice of law entails. So, when I started my legal career as a student, I did not really have much of an idea as to what are the prospects available in the legal field and in the legal domain. And it is at that time that one very senior lawyer told me that, simply put, there are two kinds of lawyers. One are the preventive lawyers, and two are the curative lawyers. Now, the preventive lawyers are transactional lawyers, the ones who draft documents, who draft conveyancing documents or a transaction document, or who drafts wills and other succession related documents. And basically, their job and role is to provide robust documents to ensure that a matter does not go into dispute or litigation. Or, in case it does go into litigation, it maximizes the chances of success by having crystal clear clauses and rights of a parties properly documented within the agreement itself. The second kind of lawyers are the curative lawyers. When things go bad, you go to a doctor. So here, curative lawyers are lawyers who address situations which emanate from disputes between the parties. They represent parties before courts and tribunals. They argue cases before the courts. So these are the lawyers who are the dispute resolution and litigation lawyers whose role comes in when things go bad and where things need redressal before the courts of law. So this, in essence, broadly speaking, for those who want to understand generally how the legal practice has developed over a period of time, you can categorize, simply put, as preventive law and curative law. Finally, ignorance of law is not an excuse. One needs to be aware, and one is presumed to be aware of what the law is. And therefore, it is important to always be abreast of the various legal developments in the economy. For instance, if I am in the manufacturing business, I cannot claim ignorance to the requirements for me to adhere to the various environmental laws and regulations in during the conduct of my manufacturing activities. I need to be aware. It is presumed that I am aware. And if I breach, it does not mean that I can take excuse of the fact that I was not aware of the existence of a particular law. So, broadly put, this is the legal system which is prevalent today. Now, when we talk about modes of dispute resolution and modes of resolving court cases and disputes between the parties, the first commercial principle or a civil principle is filing of civil suits before a civil court or a commercial court, depending on the nature of a civil suit. Now, of course, when you talk about court litigation, the quote which immediately comes to someone's mind is that litigation is virtually a legal right which ensures that everyone spends at least a decade in court. If you look at India, perhaps you can add 2 or 3 decades. So, yes, unfortunately, you do have cases where when a client comes to you, many a times a suit would have been filed by his father or his mother, and he would be pursuing it, and we would not be really surprised if it is his children who finally end up enjoying the fruits of the litigation. So, yes, there is a backlog, there is a delay, but the government and the courts are cognizant of that. And there are steps being taken. Like, for example, recently we had the Commercial Courts Act, which establishes commercial courts, which are special courts dealing with special issues in a time-bound manner. So the government is cognizant and steps are being taken to ensure that resolution of disputes is in a speedy manner and a quick and efficient way. And talking about speedy resolution of disputes, what immediately comes to the mind is the framework of arbitration and conciliation. Now, arbitration is a special private mode of resolution of disputes. You don't have to go to civil courts for enforcing your claims. Your claims can be enforced by way of arbitration. And what is necessary, which everyone needs to keep in mind, is that your contract should include, as far as possible, any commercial contract should include an arbitration clause so that when a dispute arises, it goes into arbitration and you don't have to go to a civil court and wait for 10 years and 15 years for your litigation to conclude. And that is important because under the new Arbitration Act of 2019, it has been made very, very clear that arbitration, the entire process of resolution of dispute from the filing of the claim to the conclusion of the matter, has to be resolved within a period of 1.5 years. So you have 18 months. Obviously, it's extendable 6 months at a time in case of urgent and emergent situations. But essentially, you have 18 months within which an entire dispute which otherwise before civil courts may take years, can be resolved before the alternate dispute resolution mechanism, which is in the form of arbitration. So all of us who enter into any commercial arrangement need to understand that it is imperative that we have an arbitration clause within the contract so that if a dispute arises, it directly goes into arbitration. Now, this is equally important for the purpose of attracting foreign investment into India. Foreign investors also want to see the end of the litigation. They want to see some finality. They want to see some certainty. And therefore, the government has been actively encouraging incorporation of arbitration clauses in any contract to do with the government. So always remember that arbitration is a preferred mode of resolution of disputes as far as it relates to commercial contracts. Now, apart from arbitration, we have special courts and tribunals. For example, a small causes court is a special court dealing with rent related issues. So if there is a dispute between a tenant and a landlord who is governed by the tenancy code, you will go to a small causes court, which is a special court constituted for that purpose. You cannot go to a regular civil court or arbitration in connection with hardcore tenancy related issues. Similarly, another important authority which has come up in the last 5 years is the Real Estate Authority, the RERA. Now, authority has been constituted particularly to deal and protect the interests of those who invest their money in real estate projects. So the RERA compulsorily calls for registration of real estate projects by the builder, and it provides that if the builder is not able to complete the construction within the period promised, the person who has invested his hard earned money has the right to call back the investment, has to call back right to call back the allotment money, and is also entitled to compensation. So obviously, the RERA is an act which is framed with particular legislative objects in mind, and it is obviously to protect the small investors who invest in these flats in various real estate projects. And many a times you see that the project is delayed by 4 years, 5 years. Many a times construction is stalled, but the money which you have already invested is blocked, and therefore you do not have any recourse. And keeping that object in mind, the government has come up with establishing the RERA, the Real Estate Authority, with this particular object in mind to create a smooth system where people can have recourse in case of unscrupulous practices by builders. So these are some of the special courts. We have the National Company Law Tribunal, particularly dealing with issues of winding up of companies, liquidation of companies. Many a times in companies, you will see tussles between two groups of warring shareholders. You may have read about the recent disputes between the Tatas and the Mistries, where there was a minority oppression claim. And those kind of disputes go to the National Company Law Tribunal. So if there is a dispute between two factions of shareholders within a company, you can take that dispute to the National Company Law Tribunal, who will apply the provisions of the Companies Act and take necessary steps in connection with these kind of disputes. Finally, you have the criminal courts in the system. Now, this is a completely, totally different ballgame where, unlike a civil court, you have a criminal procedure code and a totally different system which is regulated by the criminal court. So, be it a hardcore criminal issue like a murder, or be it a white collar crime, or something to do with check bouncing, whenever there is a check which is given and it bounces because of insufficiency of funds, you can initiate criminal proceedings against people who have breached in this regard. So essentially, these 4 or 5 elements are part of the system for enforcing a right within the country, and you can take recourse to any of these courts or tribunals depending on the nature of the issue concerned. Now, coming to the issue about the current COVID-19 pandemic and the impact it has had on various aspects. And if we talk about business and the contracts, many businesses have faced a lot of problem. But while we talk about the pandemic and the lockdown, one quote which is very famous, which immediately comes to my mind, is that by Charles Darwin, who once said that it is not the strongest of species who will survive, nor the most intelligent, but those who are most adaptable to change. So, adaptability to change is something which really is required and is the need of the hour. And if you look today at the current situation and the pandemic which has happened, while there are a number of heartaches, obviously there are some positive aspects as well, and there are some success stories. For instance, the world has adapted to the change and the need of the hour, and we've become virtually a world which can be almost defined as a virtual world. We have virtual webinars, we have virtual court hearings, we have virtual meetings, and we even have weddings telecast these days virtually. So everything has taken a different shape, and mankind has adapted to the need of the hour with the required changes and acted in accordance with the requirements of the day. So adaptability in a given situation like a pandemic, like a lockdown, is something which is very, very important and which can be kept in mind. So looking at the first aspect about the impact of the pandemic, now obviously the pandemic and the lockdown has had significant impact on companies and businesses, where companies had to shut down, manufacturing activities came to an end, employees had to be laid off, and a number of issues happened. And particularly, people found it very difficult to continue to perform contracts which they had entered into with various different parties. And now, in this regard, there are two different aspects which can be kept in mind. One is the purely contractual aspect of an existence of a clause which is called a force majeure clause within the body of your contract. And second is a purely legal concept of frustration of contracts. So, looking at force majeure clauses, now the object of a force majeure clause within the contract, simply put, is to keep the contract alive in the event something of a natural calamity or a war or a pandemic happens, and because of that you are unable to perform your contract. In recent times, all of us have heard about the shortage of oxygen and people being on ventilators. For a moment, if you can imagine a contract on a ventilator, so a force majeure clause essentially is resembling a contract which is put on a ventilator to somehow make it survive this difficult period, so that the rights and the liabilities of parties during this difficult period remain suspended. And when the force majeure event abates, and when the impact of the force majeure event is over, the contract revives and the rights and liabilities of parties under the contract also revive. Now, for instance, if you talk about a leave and license agreement, now even during the lockdown, a number of instances happen where people had questions as to what will happen on the payment of license fee or rent in a leave and license agreement when I'm not able to use our office premises as a result of the lockdown. And the question always boiled down to the existence or not of a force majeure clause within the contract. If you had a force majeure clause within your contract, you were safe and you could take recourse to that. And it is a lesson for us in the future to always ensure that any kind of contract, be it a commercial arrangement or a leave and license agreement, to incorporate a clause like a force majeure clause to take care of eventualities like we are facing today. Now, to broadly tell you about what are the four important aspects of a force majeure clause. Now, first, you define a force majeure event. Like you can see on the screen, the first bullet point: a war, a natural calamity, an embargo. Obviously, in light of our latest learnings, we will always include pandemic as part of a force majeure event. And then you have general words like such other circumstances beyond the control of parties, which will render performance of a contract difficult. So you define what are the nature of the events which will lead you to trigger a force majeure clause, which is the first step in connection with discussing a force majeure clause. The second step, at the second bullet, is you can always provide the manner in which a force majeure clause can be invoked. So you can always say in the clause that within 7 days or 10 days of happening of a particular event, you can invoke a force majeure clause, and you must intimate the other side, who is the party who is going to give you the benefit of the fact that you have invoked the force majeure clause. Thirdly, and most importantly, is the consequence of an invocation of a force majeure clause. Your rights and liabilities under your contract remain suspended as soon as you invoke a force majeure clause. So, for example, if your leave and license agreement says that on happening of a force majeure event, no rent will be payable for a specified period of time, or maybe 50% of the rent will be payable, or some modality will be worked out with the landlord. In such a situation, your rights and your duties and your obligations to pay that amount remain suspended, and you will only comply to the extent necessary as per the provisions of the clause which you put in the contract. So it is always important to have this clause. You can provide for suspension of your rights for a particular period of time, and you can also provide that if the force majeure event continues, then the contract will stand terminated. So these are the aspects which you can always provide. And finally, the fourth aspect is the duty of every party to try and mitigate the consequences of force majeure. Just because you have the right to invoke force majeure does not mean you put your hands up and stop performing the contract. You need to continue to perform to the extent possible. And to that extent, if there are an alternate means available for the purpose of performing a contract, or alternate source of raw material, for example, is available, you need to continue to comply and continue to perform. And you cannot say that I will not perform the contract completely or at all. Now, the question which comes up many a times is what happens when the contract does not have a force majeure clause? What are the rights I have, or what are the remedies I have in case of happening of a future uncertain event where I do not have a force majeure clause within my contract? In such a case, you come to the established principle of frustration of contracts, which is a legal remedy which is available. And talking about frustration, you have 50 to 70 years of jurisprudence which has developed in India over a period of time. And if I were to basically broadly cull out 3 or 4 basic principles about frustration of contracts, is that number one, frustration of contracts is an exception and it is not the norm. A court will be extremely reluctant to grant the remedy of frustration of contract unless absolutely necessary in a given circumstance. The intent and the trend followed by courts is to enforce the contract and to give effect to the contract and not allow parties to absolve themselves from the contract to the extent possible. So therefore, if you want to avail the remedy of frustration, the event which you complain of must be something massive and grave. It should be something which strikes to the root of the contract and fundamentally changes the nature of the contract in such a way that performance of the contract is virtually impossible or impracticable. Only in such cases the remedy of frustration will be granted. And unlike force majeure, frustration does not lead to suspension of a contract. It puts an end to the contract. The contract terminates if you are able to establish that the contract has been frustrated. And let me give you a couple of examples. Now, during the lockdown, there was a case which came up before the Bombay High Court. In connection, it was a case in the matter of standard retail. Now, what had happened is there was a shipment of certain steel products from Indonesia to Mumbai, and the ship had sailed, and after that the pandemic broke out and the lockdown happened in Mumbai. So the purchaser in Mumbai went to court and said that the contract is now frustrated because of the pandemic and the lockdown, and he is no longer able to accept the goods and he cannot perform the contract, and therefore it should be put to an end because it was frustrated. However, the court said no, there is no frustration because lockdown is a temporary event. It will abate sooner or later, and therefore you cannot absolve yourself from performing the contract. And even otherwise, the ship had already left and steel products was something which were exempted at that time, falling under necessary and essential services. So therefore, again, you look at the situation here, courts are extremely reluctant to grant the remedy of frustration, and the event, even a lockdown, was not thought to be something which is really warranting a contract being put to an end because of frustration. Now, to give you another example, which is a landmark case in Indian judicial history in connection with frustration of contracts, it is the matter called Energy Watchdog in the Supreme Court, decided by one of the most brilliant judges in India, Justice Rohinton Nariman. Now, what had happened here is the government called for a tender for producing power, and a number of power producing companies put in a bid in the tender. A group of companies who have put in a particular price bid won the tender. Now, they had put this price bid on the basis of a back to back arrangement which they had with companies in Indonesia for the purpose of securing coal. So they had coal which was available to them at a very cheap price, and therefore they were able to put in that price in the tender. After the contract was entered into, a very interesting thing happened. There was a change in law in Indonesia where the price of coal skyrocketed, and therefore the companies found it very, very difficult now to perform the contract in India at that price because the raw material price had really shot up. So what they did was they approached the government saying that the contract is frustrated and they should be absolved. There was a change in law in Indonesia and they could not perform the contract at this price anymore. The government refused. The matter finally went to Supreme Court, and Supreme Court said that in this case there is no frustration of contract, as there is nothing in the contract which indicates that coal should only be sourced from Indonesia. And so long as there is an alternate supply of coal possible, even though it may be twice as expensive, even though it may be very logistically inconvenient, you still have to perform the contract and you cannot absolve yourself from performing the contract. The contract has to be respected to the fullest. And the Supreme Court also placed reliance on a very interesting case in the early 1940s and 50s. Now, what had happened is this was a case between two countries where there was a shipment of goods between one country and another to another. And at that time, the route which was used for shipment was the Suez Canal, which was a convenient route and it was a cost effective economic route for shipment of goods and services. So, what happened was that there was a shipment which was dispatched from one country. And after that, war broke out and the Suez Canal was closed. So, therefore, the party who was shipping the goods had said he filed a case saying that the contract was frustrated because of the war and the Suez Canal was closed, and therefore he could no longer perform the contract. However, the court did not rule in his favor, and it held that just because the Suez Canal was closed does not mean that the contract is frustrated. There was an alternate route which was available, and it was all the way down south around the Cape of Good Hope under South Africa. And so long as an alternate route of transport was available, even if it may be twice as expensive, even if it is twice as logistically inconvenient, you still have to perform the contract and you will not be discharged from your duty and obligation to perform the contract. So you can see the judicial trend that the courts normally want to uphold the bargain between the parties. They do not want to absolve parties from performing a contract. And it is only in exceptional cases where there is a damage of permanent nature that the remedy of frustration will be granted to parties. Now, coming to rent and leave-in license agreements, even in during the lockdown, we did face a number of situations, like we discussed a moment earlier, about contracts of leave-in license and tenancy and the impact thereupon as a result of the pandemic. Many people found it extremely difficult to pay the rent and leave-in license during that period. So what is important to understand is that in a leave-in license agreement, if you have a force majeure clause, in such a situation, you can take recourse to that clause and you can suspend payment of your rent or defer payment of your rent in terms of the provisions of your contractual provision of force majeure. So if you have a clause within your contract, you are safe and you are protected. But many a times, what we saw in the last 1.5 years, there are many contracts, many leave and license agreements which did not have a force majeure clause. And unfortunately, in such a situation, then you are at the mercy of the landlord. And the landlord has the right to call for the rent, and there is nothing which will absolve the licensee from paying. So therefore, as a lesson in future, it is important that you incorporate and include a force majeure clause in your leave and license agreements so that in case a situation like this happens in the future, you can get the necessary benefit. Payment can be suspended and deferred for a particular period of time, and the contract can be kept alive. Now, to give you an example of how the courts look at this situation, there was a case which came up in the Delhi High Court in connection with a shop in Khan Market. Khan Market, many of us would know, is a very famous place for shopping in Delhi. Now, there was a shop there, and the lockdown happened in Delhi. Business came to a complete standstill, and there was no income for the shop. So the tenant there filed a suit before the Delhi High Court to say that there was a lockdown and his business had come to a grinding halt, and therefore he should be absolved from payment of rent. So the Delhi High Court explored whether there was an agreement between the tenant and the landlord and whether that agreement had a force majeure clause. And it said that had there been a force majeure clause in the contract, it would definitely have granted the relief to the tenant in terms of the requirements of the force majeure clause. But in this case, unfortunately for the tenant, there was no force majeure clause, and therefore the court was constrained and it could not grant any relief in terms of payment of rent to the particular tenant of this particular shop. So you look at the judicial trend, even in the current situation, unless and until you have a force majeure clause, you may not be able to really enforce a particular right. And then in such a situation, everything depends upon the goodwill and the relationship which you share with the landlord. There have been many landlords who have been very understanding, and even in the absence of a force majeure clause, they have agreed to either suspension of rent or reduction of rent in many situations and many cases. And always, if such mutual compromise can be worked out, there is nothing like it. Litigation can always be avoided. But there is no right. You cannot enforce a right. You cannot compel the landlord to agree in the absence of a force majeure clause. And therefore, as a lesson for the future, always remember to ensure that this clause is incorporated within the terms of your agreement. Even talking about internationally, we may remember that in 2003, there was another epidemic which broke out in China and Hong Kong called the SARS epidemic, which was similar to COVID-19. Unfortunately, whenever we talk about pandemic, the name of China comes up. So looking at that, I mean, there was a situation where the epidemic broke out in Hong Kong. And what happened that there was an agreement for taking a premises on rent in a particular housing society, which was suffering as a result. There were a number of cases in that society in connection with the SARS epidemic. And someone filed a case saying that because of the SARS epidemic, he did not want to go ahead and take the property on leave and license in that particular housing society, and he should be absolved because it was an event of frustration. And the court said, no, there is no frustration and there is no force majeure clause in your agreement, and therefore no remedy will be granted. SARS epidemic is again a temporary event, and you will have to go ahead and perform the contract. So again, we realize the importance of having a force majeure clause within the terms of your contract. Now, even if you look at countries like Germany, Singapore, United Kingdom, a number of steps were taken by many of the countries in connection with resolving disputes between landlords and tenants. So, for example, a couple of these countries came up with a law that for 6 months there will be a moratorium and no landlord will be initiating any proceeding against a tenant for the recovery of the premises in case the tenant is unable to pay the rent. So this is again a welcome development in spectrum of what we look as a crisis for many of the tenants because they were unable to pay the rent. And some countries took the stand that there should be a moratorium given and proceedings should not be initiated for eviction in such a situation. If you remember, even the Maharashtra government had come out with an advisory to the landlords saying, do not insist on payment of rent in the initial parts of the pandemic. But that was in the nature of an advisory. It did not have the force of law. It was just a simple request to the landlords not to really enforce payment of rent to the extent possible in the early days of the pandemic. There were a number of regulatory and judicial measures which the government of India took as a result of the pandemic, particularly in contracts with the government. Now, the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Shipping came up with notifications which said that the COVID-19 pandemic should be treated as a force majeure event, and parties who are contracting with the government should be given the necessary relief. We saw a number of cases in infrastructure projects like a road project or a port project where construction was on, and the government was liberal enough to grant the remedy by way of a notification for extension of time to various private parties to complete the project. So you could have an extension of up to 6 months to complete your project. And the time which was lost as a result of the lockdown and the pandemic was compensated. Another important provision of general importance was the Reserve Bank of India also declared a moratorium on payment of EMIs for loans during the pandemic. And that was again another very beneficial step for people who found it very difficult to meet with the loan obligation because the income source had dried up, businesses were down, and therefore the Reserve Bank of India, in discussion with the government of India, came up with a policy of moratorium in such a situation for a particular period of time. The government also suspended the application of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, where you could not have filed a new case before the NCLT calling for winding up of a company for its ability to not pay the debts. So if a company was not able to pay the debts, in such a case, for a period of 1 year, you could not initiate any winding up proceeding against the company under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. So this was also a beneficial legislation, and it protected a number of businesses who are unable to meet with the payment obligations because their business had come to a grinding halt, the factories were shut, they could not really have any particular income source, and consequently, they were unable to make payments to their contractors. So in such a situation, the relief was granted by the government of India. And finally, Supreme Court extended the period of limitation for filing suits and proceedings. Now, one must understand, talking about litigation, whenever you file a case, there is a period of limitation within which you have to invoke the jurisdiction of a court and approach a court with a suit or a litigation. Otherwise, you are not able to file and you will be ousted from filing a case before a court. So, for example, in many cases, you have to file a suit or a proceeding within 3 years of becoming aware of a cause of action which leads to a suit. If you don't file within 3 years, you lose your right to file a suit. And the Supreme Court understood that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was very difficult for parties to meet with this timeline of filing a suit or a proceeding before a court. And therefore, from March 15, 2020, the period of limitation under any general or special law in India was suspended and excluded. So a period of limitation will not apply. And this period, which falls after March 15, 2020, was excluded while computing the period of limitation. So this is another very, very important development. And that order is still in force. So the period of limitation continues to remain suspended. As they say, even an average compromise is better and then the best looking lawsuit, because you can always work out situations arising between parties amicably. You can arrive at amicable solutions. You can resolve your disputes to the extent possible, and you can obviate the necessity or the need to go to court to enforce a particular right. Now, Singapore also led by example. It came up during the pandemic with the COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act, which said that you cannot file any proceeding. There will be a moratorium at least 3 to 6 months on filing any proceeding in connection with any contract relating to either to the construction industry or the tourism industry or other industries which were affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So a moratorium was imposed on filing suits, and which gave sufficient time to parties to try and work out an amicable solution and come to a compromise deal by which they can move forward hand in hand, keeping each other's interests in mind. So, this is, of course, the best possible approach available in a situation like the one we are facing today. Also, they say that COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in a lot of uncertainty. And as the saying goes, failure to prepare is like preparing to fail. Therefore, many a times it is important for us to prepare for the worst. Even drawing up wills, though it is associated with death, it is something which may not be a glamorous topic, but something which we can always keep in mind. And it is important for us to think about the disposition of our property in future, particularly keeping in mind what we've seen over the last 1.5 years, which is the uncertainty which has developed over the course of the pandemic which we just saw. And here, drawing up a will has a lot of benefits. You put in a crystal clear disposition of what the properties you own are, how they will be distributed, to whom it will be distributed, and in what proportion they will be distributed. Many a times you will see that preparing a will, you apply your mind and list down all the necessary properties, movable, immovable assets that you may have. And this has a distinct advantage because we have seen many cases where the children do not even know what the properties are in existence which are owned by their parents or by their forefathers. So you will find maybe 10 years down the line that there is some property which you own in some remote corner in Gujarat, which you were not even aware of because there was no will. And by the time you become aware of that property has already been usurped. So therefore, when you draw up a will, it's an important exercise where you put down your thoughts, all the properties which you have are listed down in one place, and you have the right to decide within your will who will be the beneficiaries of those properties. And it need not necessarily be a legal heir. It can be anyone whom you want to pass on these properties to. A will can also provide within its body an executor who will be in charge of executing the will. Now, when you talk about will, you need it to be attested by at least 2 or more witnesses. Basically, people who will see the testator sign in their presence. Because tomorrow, if there is any dispute or the authenticity or the signature in the will is challenged, you will know that we have witnesses who have seen the execution of the will, and therefore they will testify if there is a need to do so. Therefore, it is important to have at least 2 or more witnesses who have seen the testator sign the will. Another question which keeps coming up from time to time is whether it is mandatory to register a will. Now, it is not mandatory to register a will, but it is always advisable to do so. Now, registration includes elaborate procedures where you go and sign in front of the registrar when you're making the will, your witnesses will sign, and many a times it is all videotaped. So, in that sense, you will have a crystal clear record of registration. And tomorrow, for example, if you lose a copy of the will, you will always have a will which will be available with the registrar. In case tomorrow, if there is a question on the execution of the will or the authenticity of the will, you will always have a copy of the will which is available with the registrar, which shows that it has been duly executed and registered. So there are some distinct advantages one has, though it is not mandatory to register. One can always think about doing it because, as I said, there are some advantages, particularly in case of an uncertain event in the future. If a will is challenged by someone, in such a case, it is important that registration will definitely help as an additional factor to come to the assistance of the person who is trying to enforce a will. If there is no will, in such a situation, the rules of intestate succession will apply. The Indian Succession Act has an entire schedule which applies to parties, where the rules of succession are given and the manner in which a property is to be distributed between the legal heirs and the relatives of the deceased is clearly specified in a very, very detailed form, what proportion it will be distributed between whom and which relatives is all specified in the schedule to the Indian Succession Act. But as I said, it is always better that you yourself decide the disposition of your property through a will and provide in crystal clear terms as to how the disposition has to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, what I have come to believe is there is one common thread which runs through professions like law, medicine, and also businesses. And that common thread is the success which has been exhibited by the Parsi Zoroastrian community in India in their endeavors and in the projects which they undertake. And this success is a result of the resolve that we have shown as a community. And our resolve is not defined by the expenses of our trust properties or the financial success we have seen, but our resolve is summed up in a simple premise, which is a system of core values which have been passing down from generation to generation and which have come to be associated with Parsis in India. That amongst integrity, perseverance, and excellence are values which define us as a community. Recently, we had the Honorable Prime Minister give a speech where he said that Parsis in India are a distinct example of sugar in milk. They contribute rather than complain. They give rather than demand. And they create rather than destroy. And through our conduct, we have created a special place in the hearts and in the minds of the fellow Indian citizen. That is the unique heritage that we enjoy and which we have inherited from our forefathers and which we need to continue to propagate and follow those principles and core values which define us as a community. And what we have done with immaculate precision over a period of time is to show that within the community, there is a spirit of interdependence and cooperation. That when there is someone in the community who is in need of funds or who is looking to start a new business, you will always have organizations and people who will step forward with the necessary aid and assistance. If you have someone in the community who is looking for a scholarship for studying, you will have organizations and people within the community who will be more than happy to assist and help for the person to give effect to his dreams and wings to his passion. So, in that sense, we have exhibited a spirit of interdependence and cooperation within the fold of the community. And the Zoroastrian Parsi community is an ecosystem in itself. There are various players, there are various contributories, and each of us, by our individual endeavors, contribute to the success of the community. For example, be it a mobed or a priest who devotes himself to the service of the fire in the fire temple, or a Parsi businessman or a professional who devotes himself to his own business, or a student who burns the midnight oil to achieve success in his exams. All of us, in our own way, contribute to this common pool, which is the Parsi Zoroastrian community. And that spirit of cooperation and interdependence and contribution has continued over a period of time and continues even now and will continue in future, like our fire, which continues to burn regardless of all the obstacles. Ladies and gentlemen, in the current pandemic, Parsi Zoroastrians have not only stood shoulder by shoulder, but have led the battle from the front, and particularly in terms of distribution, manufacture of vaccines, and have taken a leading role to positively affect the lives of millions and billions of our fellow countrymen. ladies and gentlemen, we as a community, in fact, through our conduct in the last 1.5 years, have personified the phrase which says that life is not about waiting for the storm to pass, it is about learning to dance in the rain. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you have enjoyed the session. I'm very happy to take any questions which you may have.
Thank you, Zurich. That was a it was an extremely knowledgeable, and we got to learn a lot about law. Yes, law seems to be very scary, but I must say you made it rather simple. So thank you very much for that. I would like to go on with the first question. It's a rather long question. An ownership flat in Registered Cooperative Housing Society Limited, Mumbai, meant only for the Parsi Irani Zoroastrian members. Actually, the plot on which the building stands is covered by the restrictive covenant contained in the agreement dated 12th October 1926 under the deed of assignment dated 3rd May 1961. Was owned by two siblings and inherited from their ancestors. One of the siblings dies in 2013. Now, the only sole male owner of the flat nominates his niece, that is the daughter of the sister who died in 2013. And the nomination is duly captured by the society. He then marries a non-Parsi in 2015 under the Special Marriage Act and starts staying in the said flat. Now, this gentleman expires in 2018 without any will or change of nomination. The non-Parsi wife continues to be in sole and exclusive possession and continuous occupation of the flat, declining to either vacate the premises or part with the original share certificate. In such a case, what legal right the society and the nominee have? The society has made the Parsi Zoroastrian nominee a deemed member of the society after passing the resolution in their AGM. Please advise.
So it's a rather detailed question, but I'll try and give a short answer to this. Now, let me first tell you a very important concept here, talking about nomination and succession in connection with housing societies. So the law which has evolved over the last 5 years, where there are a number of High Court decisions which say that nomination will always be subservient to succession. So nomination is a temporary act, but finally, for the purpose of owning a property or getting a property transferred, it is important to look at the succession documents. So if you have a will which has a disposition, it will always prevail over nomination. And nomination, of course, is important. It's a temporary act. The nominee will be a custodian of the property till the rights under the testamentary documents are enforced. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. In this given situation, which you just highlighted, there is no will, and therefore the rules of intestate succession would apply. And in such a case, the property will devolve in terms of those rules of intestate succession. Now, one thing which comes out from what your question is in connection with succession, in connection with a property which has a covenant which is Zoroastrian only. In such a situation, it may not be possible for succession in contravention of such a provision, because such a provision obviously is attached to land, it goes with the land, and therefore that covenant will necessarily be enforced as being connected to land. So even though someone else who may not be a Zoroastrian may be someone who may inherit as a result of succession, that person may find it challenging in case of a dispute or before a court of law to get a legal right, because the society will always argue that there was a covenant attached with land, and that covenant says that this is a Zoroastrian only premises. So in that sense, this will be the argument which will be put forth by the society, and it will be difficult to say that succession will override the covenant which is attached to the land, because that obviously will also be given effect to. So this is something which one can keep in mind. But having said that, on a general basis, what can be important is, even if you have done a nomination in a society, please do still execute a will, because succession, as I say, will always prevail over nomination. And even though a nominee may temporarily hold the property as a custodian, finally, it is always important to have a will which is eventually probated before a court for the purpose of finally enforcing those rights. So I hope this generally covers the discussion on this.
Thank you. I'm sure it does. And I think it was Mr. Rohinton who asked this question. In case he has any other issues, you can contact Advocate Zarif Dastoor on a more personal level. He has given his coordinates here, his phone number, and his email ID. Going to the next question, Mr. Dastoor, it is from Mr. Mehta. He says our building at Forget Street, Tardeo, is going for redevelopment. It was originally a Parsi trust building and sold by the trustees to a Jain builder. The developer is trying all tactics to vacate the 10 Parsi tenants left in the building. Majority of them are senior citizens. The building comes under MHADA. My question is, how do we safeguard our rights in terms of transit rent, corpus, carpet area, bank guarantees, etc., etc.?
So the answer here, in case you have agreed for redevelopment, normally it requires the consent of around, I think, 51% of the occupants or tenants. If it has been agreed that the building will go into redevelopment, in such a case, to protect your rights, which you just listed out, it is important that you execute a detailed agreement which will spell out all these rights and obligations within one document. And in case you need to take recourse, then you will have a contractual rights which are all documented. It should never be left open verbally, or you should not really rely upon promises which are not really put down on paper. So it is important for the purpose of securing your rights in case you go ahead with the redevelopment to ensure that it is documented in the form of an agreement. But this is one aspect. One very interesting aspect I would like to highlight on this very issue is the case which I just argued around 3 days back before the Real Estate Authority. Now, as I said in my talk, we have the RERA, which is a real estate authority which has come up recently, and real estate projects, including a redevelopment project, require to be registered with RERA. So this authority always has a supervisory control over any builder who is either developing a project or even redeveloping an existing project. So this is important to keep in mind, that in case there is a breach, in case there is a violation by the builder, you always have recourse to take advantage of the provisions of the RERA Act and file a case before the RERA seeking protection. Now, this is a very complex legal issue, and in fact, it is something which is yet to be decided. And the issue is as follows: whether an agreement for permanent alternate accommodation, like in the example which you gave, because you will be getting a flat in exchange for a flat. So in that case, whether a permanent alternate accommodation agreement will form part of the RERA, and whether the provisions of RERA will apply in such a case. And what I argued, based on certain recent developments which have happened in this sphere, is that a permanent alternate accommodation agreement is as much an agreement for allotment as an agreement for allotment for in return for consideration or a price or a sum of money. So when you are exchanging your property, you are as much entitled to the benefits of the provisions of RERA as you would have been had you been paying a monetary sum for the same flat. So that is the argument which has been put forth. And in fact, just for your benefit, in 2020 December, there were judgments passed by RERA giving reliefs to tenants who were deprived of flats by builders who did not give effect to the arrangement exactly in the nature of which you are seeking. So what had happened is someone was promised the floor a flat on a 20th floor of a building, and the building only was constructed to the extent of 19 floors. There was no 20th floor. So when that person filed a complaint saying that I was a tenant, I've given up my flat in promise and for a return and an exchange of another flat in the new building, and there was no floor itself which was constructed where I was promised a flat. In such a case, RERA came down heavily on the builder, and an alternate flat was awarded, and even compensation was awarded, including transit rent, what you just mentioned. So if you have a provision within your contract which says that till the building is constructed, you will be paid transit rent by the builder so that you can obviously stay somewhere else during that period. Such a provision can also be enforced. And in this very case, in December 2020, the order was passed by RERA directing the builder also to pay transit rent to the tenant who was suffering as a result of the acts of the builder. So basically, you can always think about taking recourse to the RERA in such a situation in the nature of what you have highlighted.
Okay. I think that is clear enough. But there is one thing that we would like to ask here is that there are many situations here where we do not know which way to go. And we need somebody to help us take that first step. So do you think an arbitrator will work here? Do you think somebody like an agent, somebody who will tell you, okay, this is what is to be done. So where do we start looking?
So what basically we are looking for is essentially a legal advisor or a lawyer or a consultant who is acquainted with the law. You have many of, for example, in dealing with property matters, you have consultants who provide these services where they are specialists in dealing with property matters, where they will be well aware of various development control regulations, the MADA, the RERA, and various laws which are operating in the property sphere. So you will have consultants, you will have legal advisors, you will have chartered accountants who will be specializing in various different aspects and areas. So if you're looking at a dispute in connection with a real estate project, you have consultants who only operate in that field, who specialize in that field, and you can always take recourse to them. Otherwise, generally, any legal advisor will be able to at least generally assist you and point you in the right direction of a specialist consultant who may be able to help you. An arbitrator would obviously be something very different. An arbitrator is basically a judge who decides a dispute between two parties in a contract. So that is something which is very different. But what I think what you essentially mean is someone who is a specialist or a consultant who really provides services to a client and gives them the necessary advice in the right direction. And it's a good thing because prevention is always better than cure. Rather than waiting for things to go wrong, it is always advisable to take the first step and preempt any kind of situation which you don't want to really fall in by taking the right advice at the right time. A stitch in time always saves nine.
Saves nine, absolutely. Yes, that is true. We have another question by Mrs. Irani. She said, she's asking, what right does a married daughter have with the respect of a tenanted flat of her parents? Does she need to take any action while her parents are alive to include her name in the rent receipt, etc., whatever is required, so as to establish her right to the flat after their demise?
The important thing, the basic fundamental principle in connection with tenancy, which one must understand, is that tenancy normally passes on by virtue of residence. So if someone who is a legal heir, be it a son or a daughter, or even a married daughter who's residing with the father or the mother who is a tenant, at the time of death, you automatically become a deemed tenant. So what is very important in such a situation is residence and a person residing at the time of death of the original tenant to claim a tenancy right. So that is a basic principle which is generally accepted and which is applicable. So obviously your necessary documentation will represent the fact that you are staying there with the tenant at the time of the death of the tenant. Now, having said that, one may take note of a very important judgment of the Supreme Court in 2019, where the Supreme Court, dealing with the Goa Rent Act, basically has laid down a principle that a married daughter will be as much a legal heir to a property as anyone else. And just because of her marital status, she will not be disentitled from the legal heirship of a particular tenanted premises. Now, the only difference here was that premises which we were talking about in the Goa Rentac dispute was in connection with the premises owned by a partnership firm which the father was running. So the judgment is in that context. It's in context of a commercial premises where it was said that the married daughter is equally entitled, and just because she is married, she is not going to be deprived of her legal status as a legal heir. So that can be something which can always be kept in mind.
The next question is basically asking whether a will prevails over nominations. You did mention that.
In fact, there is a judgment of the Bombay High Court, very, very recently passed, which squarely covers the issue where a will, which is a succession related document, will prevail over nomination. So, nomination, as I indicated earlier, is an important aspect, but it's a temporary aspect, and it will give way to a succession document like a will.
So it's always imperative that if a person dies intestate, to make a succession certificate or an indemnity bond or an affidavit. I don't know what is necessary.
Yeah, so if a person dies intestate, in
Yes.
such a case, many times you come up with the concept of a succession certificate. So you
Yes.
go to court and say that these are the movable assets, like basically bank deposits or PF deposits and demat accounts, and say that I am the legal heir and declare me so that I become entitled to these movable assets. So succession certificate normally is in the context of movable assets like bank deposits, demat account, etc. So that is something in case a person has died intestate.
Right. But then if there is a nominee there also, does the succession certificate apply?
So as I said, finally, any testamentary document will always prevail over nomination. So many a times a nominee will be the person who will finally go and get the succession certificate being the legal heir. So many a time there will be a lot of congruence between the two. But if at all in a exceptional case there is a dispute or there is a difference, in that case either a will or a succession certificate or a probate will always prevail.
Okay. Okay. So then this next question, which is in case a will has been made before death, but after death, the surviving relatives say that a new will was created and your name was struck off. How does that pan out?
So this is a classic dispute situation. Many a times what we see in courts, that the authenticity of an existing will is challenged, or it is mentioned that this was an old will and subsequently there was a revocation or a change, and the new will does not include the name of a legal heir. So finally, this is a matter of evidence. So both the parties who are have competing rights and competing claims will have to put in evidence before the court to try and prove as to whose stand is correct and which is the valid will. They'll have to show which is the one which is validly executed and which was the one in force. And what the court will do will be to balance competing claims and balance the evidence and weigh the evidence as to who, according to the court, is speaking the truth and which is the real will which is supposed to be enforced, which is the one which is executed later in point of time, and if at all the earlier will has been revoked. So it is a matter of evidence before a court in a situation which is in the nature of a dispute between two competing claims between two parties who claim to be legal heirs. So this situation is a classic situation where you will see a number of such cases before courts and tribunals where there will be different claims in connection with wills and succession.
Okay. Now, if there are two wills involved, the first one is registered and the second one is not, then what is the situation like?
Yes, so again, if the second one is not, but if it is still a valid will which revokes the first one, because a will can be revoked at any point of time,
Anything.
whether
Yes.
registered or not.
Mhm.
So even a registered will can of course be revoked. So as far as it is validly proved that there was a subsequent will which revokes the earlier one, in such a case, the party will have a lot to say in court because there is a subsequent will which he is able to demonstrate was the subsequent will. And as I said, registration is not a mandatory process. So that
Right.
cannot really be something which can be taken recourse to in such a situation.
Oh, thank you. One question here is, can you please elaborate any safeguards a Parsi trust as a landlord needs to keep in mind in their lease deeds with commercial tenants, Parsi or non-Parsi, keeping in mind that lockdowns could happen in the future too. Such trusts have to pay their salaries, utility bills, taxes, etc. And stoppage of rents would affect that cash flow.
Yes, so this question is very interesting because it's exactly the opposite perspective from the perspective of the landlord, which we've been discussing, rather than the tenant. So here, essentially, in the query, what it boils down to is a situation on the negotiation of the force majeure clause. So you can negotiate so as not to have a clause in the nature of a force majeure clause, which will say that the entire rent has to be suspended. You can basically balance the rights. You can have a clause which say maybe the landlord and the tenant will discuss and decide proportionate reduction in commensurate to the nature of the problem faced, or you can say that maybe rent will not be completely let go of. It will be suspended for the time being, and eventually it will revive, and when things get better, you will get the payment of the rent. So it is a virtual deferral of payment of rent. Or you can even agree that a particular percentage of rent will reduce depending on the gravity of the situation. So you can say maybe instead of 100% for a period of 3 months, you will pay 70% or 50%. So it's a matter of negotiation and to see that a balance is created and it is not one-sided either from the perspective of the tenant or from the perspective of the landlord. So that's a matter of negotiation of this particular clause from both the perspectives.
Can a restaurant bequeath his or her agricultural property to another Parsi who is not a blood relative?
Yes, in a sense, a property can always be bequeathed to someone, whether you are a legal heir or otherwise. That's the beauty about wills. If you do not create a will, or if you do not have a will, then the law of intestate succession will apply, where the strict rules under the Indian Succession Act will be applicable, and it will only go to the relatives in the proportion which is specified in the Indian Succession Act. However, if you have a will, you have a freedom of choice. You can give it to anyone who is not a relative. You can distribute it in whatever share you want, and you can basically put in the terms and conditions of the disposition. You can even create a trust in many a times in connection with properties. So a lot of free will is available with execution of a will, and therefore that is something which can always be kept in mind, and therefore it is always advisable to have a will so that you can exercise your free will when you want to.
So where there's a will, there's a way.
Always.
Yes, sir. Okay, the last question that we will entertain today, and if anybody else has any more questions, please feel free to write into Advocate Sarik Kustur at his personal coordinates, which are shown on the screen. What do you do with people who just go and start staying with their family, an aunt and uncle, with all probability, and the uncle dies, and after that claims the property as his or her own? How do you approach such an issue?
So it's a question of fact. It depends on whom you're dealing with. If you're talking about a blood relative who is residing with that particular individual, then of course that person may claim inheritance rights. But if you're talking about someone who is virtually unrelated or has a very remote connection, who barges into a property and starts staying, then in that case, such a person becomes a trespasser. In which case, you have as a landlord, you have the right to get that person evicted from that property. So it is a matter of fact. It's a question of fact, depends on the facts and circumstances of a case to be seen in individual situations, and accordingly a decision can be taken in that regard.
But for that also you need to go to the court to
Absolutely.
get your eviction notice.
Absolutely. We don't normally physically throw out people.
That would have made life simpler though. But if you're not a blood relative, then yes, you have to take that course of action where you will need to go in a proper legal manner. And how long approximately will that take, sir?
So it again depends. Sometimes situations are emergent and you can show that the person is a complete trespasser. And this kind of a remedy does not really take as long as determining final rights in a civil suit in connection with either a issue of fact or law. Here it's a straightforward issue of whether the person is a trespasser or not, and you have quick adjudicatory mechanism in such a situation where the relief will be pretty quick. So unlike the general trend about delays associated with litigation, this aspect may not really take that much amount of time. And with the new model rent act which is coming in, if it is enforced in Maharashtra, in such a situation, there are many other provisions which will be applicable, which will streamline the process, including the time-bound dispute resolution mechanism in connection with many issues and disputes between landlords and tenants.
That's a good news. And with that, we come to an end of our today's session. Thank you, Advocate Zarek Dastoor. It was really, really informative, and I think you managed to sort out a lot of doubts. So thank you once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. If anyone has any query, I'm most happy to answer. You can always email. My email ID is mentioned there, and I'll be happy to take any further questions.
Thank you. And please follow us, GeoParsi, on Instagram, and you are welcome to go and check our website, www.geoparsi.org. Thank you and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.